Bhaktivinodaya Satchidanandanamine Gaura Shakti Swarupaya Vipaloka Parayati. Hare Krishna. Sorry for being late. We were visiting the Parthasarthi temple, and one Archaka there was very enthusiastic to take us to all the different sannidhis. We got a little delayed. So I was asking, why you're not chanting a song of Bhaktivinoda Thakur? Why Narottam Das? But actually it's very similar mode. Narottam Das and Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Very simple, sweet, direct, straightforward, if you can understand Bengali. Actually, I only learned Bengali because I wanted to understand these songs. It could be said, however, that Bhaktivinoda Thakur's songs, there's a lot more philosophical analysis in the songs of Bhaktivinoda Thakur than in the songs of Narottam Das. Very full of feeling and description of the Lord. It fully expresses the moods of a devotee of the Lord. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, what is his contribution? Here in South India there are many great acharyas who are very well known. That culture is very strong here too. Tamil translation is required. Last week it was done at the back. You're going to go like that?
தமிழே கேட்க விரும்புபவர்கள் அதைத்தான் புரிந்து கொள்ளக்கூடியவர்கள் பின்னாடி உட்கார்ந்த சௌகரியமா இருக்கும். பின்னாடி பேசலாம்.
At that period in Bengal, we can say more or less Bhaktivinoda Thakur his contribution spanned mostly 19th century. And he lived in this world up until 1914. For the last few years, he was more or less fully retired. Please don't lean on the nurses. So that period, the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Bengalis, they're proud of the prominent personalities who emerged at that time from Bengal. That time the capital of British India was in Bengal, and the British had especially put emphasis on educating in Western education Bengalis. So many of the prominent people in India at that time came from Bengal, and their names are well known even today. Some of the great religious, or from the Vaishnava standpoint, which means the actual standpoint, irreligious leaders of the age. Especially there was one Gadadhar Chattopadhyay, who's otherwise known as Ramakrishna, and his most prominent disciple in bringing misfortune into the world, Swami Vivekananda, and Aurobindo Ghosh in the secular field. Actually, they're all in the secular field, they're not in the spiritual field. So there's Jagadish Chandra Ghosh. So there are so many Bengalis whose names are well known up to the present day. But unfortunately, Bhaktivinoda Thakur is not well known among Bengalis in general. It's most unfortunate. He's much greater than all of them put together. They have nothing actual to contribute to the world. Actually, I was just looking at some of the completed complete works of Swami Vivekananda, and one of his disciples asked him, should we eat meat? What's wrong with it? And he said, yes, you should eat meat. Eat lots of fish and meat. That will make you strong. Also, yeah, there's that also. That is to play football and read Bhagavad Gita and so many wrong things he said. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this is a symptom of the age of Kali, that such a great Acharya has appeared, and people who are teaching all the wrong things, they become very popular. And who's teaching the right thing, people don't know about it. Isn't that typical? It's just like you see that any fool with a little bit of spunk, a little bit of bravado, he can get up and advertise himself as God and he'll become famous. And they're coming out more and more. I guess there are no jobs, so people have to become God instead. It's very difficult to get a job these days, so you just announce yourself as God. And then you see that people give you food and money and all these things. So there are so many people who are well known and become famous like this, but we see Prabhupada gradually, because we're distributing Prabhupada's books, his name is somewhat known. Otherwise, people don't know the name of Prabhupada, who's given them, in the words of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Vastavik Vastu. The really real thing, the actual substance. Prabhupada is given actual substance, but people don't know so much. If someone comes and says, we'll teach you some technique by which you can relax better, or by which you can have sex life better, then they'll think, oh, this is the real Swami. But if someone teaches the real thing, how to give up sense gratification, surrender to Krishna, then they don't become, people are not so much attracted. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, not very well known, although his contributions are phenomenal. It's not that you see a list of names, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur's in there, and he's just one in a list of names. But he's included in that list of names. That list of names we have in our parampara. There are so many devotees after Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So many great devotees. And not all the names are in that parampara. Even you see Rasikananda, Shamananda, what great preachers. But their names are not there in the parampara, but their names aren't specifically included. So they had a great contribution to the parampara in preaching, making so many devotees. Due to Shamananda and Rasikananda, practically because of them, the whole of Orissa is under the general trend of Hinduism in Orissa is towards Vaishnavism. We can say that as a general statement. But their names are not there. So what did Bhaktivinoda Thakur do? What is it? Well, he did. What does he do to be included in the list of names there? He revived the movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at a time when it appeared to be wholly obscured by people who had misrepresented what is Krishna consciousness. I was saying that the movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is spread all over Orissa and Bengal. That's true, but even today you'll find in Orissa and Bengal practically all the Vaishnavas are fish eaters, which doesn't sound correct, does it? You say a Vaishnava is a fish eater. He is a Vaishnava and he eats fish. It doesn't seem to make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, but that's just an indication of how the true understanding of Krishna consciousness had become covered over. And that fish eating, that wasn't the worst bit. There was very many bad things that were going on. Actually, I'm making this book on Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and I've given a lot of detail of all the degradation that was going on in the name of Gauriya Vaishnavism, in the name of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, all the different upper sampradayas. So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was the first to speak out against this in a systematic manner, and he was the first. That time was a bridge, you could say, or a watershed in Indian social history, that Indians, the first time they were becoming very much exposed to the Western culture, and the Western culture was for the first time making deep inroads into the Indian way of life. And the whole concept of logical thinking according to the Western idea, of course not that logical thinking is absent in traditional Indian culture, but the British, they advertised themselves. Who's that playing with the coin? I can stop that. They advertised that Indian thinking is irrational, and the Western way of thinking is rational. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was schooled, he was from a typical traditional Indian family, but he was schooled both in the traditional way, he had Sanskrit education, but his prime education was according to the British system. And if you see his early writings, you can see he was more influenced by Christianity. And the first of his writings was called the Puriyat, which was in English, but it was about a Greek hero. So why should he write about a Greek hero if he's sitting in India and in English? Because at that time in India, the British education was based on the Greek and Latin classics. And one chief of the Indian office, Lord Macaulay, he wrote that any single book from one shelf of any library of any British gentleman is worth more than all the writings of the Hindus put together. That's what they felt. So this was the education Bhaktivinoda Thakur got. So he appeared to be much disaffected with Indian way of thinking and much enamored by the Christian way of thinking. He appeared to be like a typical young, educated Bengali of the day in rejecting his culture. It started back then. It's not new. But the process that the British put into motion of that Indians should reject their own culture, that became accelerated when the British left and the Indians took over. And then Pandit Nehru and others, they were made in England, although born in India, but their whole way of thinking was made in England. So they accelerated the process more. So anyway, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he, as a young, educated, Western educated Indian at the time, he appeared to be very much rejecting his own culture, taking up the unspoken but implied British message that the only hope for India is if you become Westernized. You're not really intelligent enough to become as good as us ever, but if you become Western educated, then you'll become qualified to lick our boots. That was, at the moment you're not even qualified to lick our boots, but if you become Western educated, then we'll allow you to lick our boots. This was the implied message. And actually Vivekananda, we were just talking about that person, he was saying that you have to eat meat and then you will become strong. Actually, in saying that, he was pandering to the West. He was known as a nationalist, but he said you should eat meat, and he said just compare the meat-eating countries with our vegetarian. This vegetarianism has done great harm to India. So he was, by saying that, he was indirectly saying that the Western countries are better than India because they eat meat and they're much stronger. Of course, in South America, they're meat eaters also. They're also, what good did it do? They weren't dominating the world. So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he appeared to be enamored by this. But This we can see it's just like Leela. He's a pure devotee. Great, not say he's a pure devotee, that's a general description, but he's an intimate associate of Sri Radha Krishna. Kamala Manjari, that is his internal identity. He's an assistant of Srimati Radharani. So, as a pastime, he appeared to be enamored by the Western way of thinking. But then when he came across Chaitanya Bhagavat, and he came across Srimad Bhagavatam and read that, and then he became convinced that this is the Vastavik Vastu, this is the real thing. This is far more advanced than anything that Christianity has to offer. So then he studied Sanskrit more so he could have more access to that. And he read Chaitanya Bhagavat, and he wrote such books. Especially these two books, he wrote many books. But the Jaiva Dharma and Chaitanya Charitamrita, in a very systematic manner which will appeal to modern man even today. He has analyzed what are the different modes of religious thought and presented the Krishna consciousness as given by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as supreme. So these books, they were written just to address the rational mindset of the day. And very systematically, it's a typical feature of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writings, that he addresses everything systematically, he puts everything in order, puts everything in categories, and makes everything very clear and easy to understand. So these two books, especially Bhaktivinoda Saraswati Thakur, he was very anxious that these two books in particular, they should be translated and distributed among the Western people, so that they can understand what is the superior position of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teachings and philosophy. So those books, and he wrote many other books, his songs especially, apart from these two exegetical books, these exegetical in the sense that they present the philosophy of Srimad Bhagavatam in a systematic manner. He also presented Srimad Bhagavatam, he took 1,000 verses and presented in different categories. What is the message of Bhagavatam? It's just like, you know this Anvaya, when you take the Sanskrit verse, and then you take the words out and you put them in order, so it's easy to understand. So like that, he took the whole Bhagavatam, took 1,000 verses, gave a little commentary, Bhagavad Artha Marichi Mala. That's another of his books, in which he described how he got the inspiration to write this book. That Swarup Damodar Goswami came to him and told him, Swarup Damodar Goswami, who was the most intimate associate of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, came to him and told him, you should compile this book for the benefit of human society. So there are these books, so many books he wrote. Krishna Samhita, if you read that, you'll wonder, how is he writing? Because he writes many strange things, but he presents in the beginning Srimad Bhagavatam in a manner that is useful for the ass-like people. In that book he writes that there are two kinds of people, the ass-like people and the swan-like people. So first of all, he presents Srimad Bhagavatam in a manner that might be appealing to persons of ass-like mentality. And he writes how the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas, they were competing with each other, and therefore there are so many apparently strange things he wrote. And then he wrote, okay, that's for the ass-like people, now he presented Srimad Bhagavatam for the swan-like people. So he wrote it in that way, just to appeal to the mundane scholars, that Srimad Bhagavatam is something worth reading. And then he gave the actual message of Srimad Bhagavatam. So many books he wrote. His songs, especially, so many songs. You'll see he compiled all these songs. Practically in about 2 years, all his songs came out. Sharanagati and Gita. Actually, many of these songs which we have collected, this Gita, he didn't actually write them as a collection, but they were later collected, I believe, by Sundarananda Vidyavinoda, disciple of Bhaktivinoda Saraswati Thakur. He just published them in his magazine, Sharanagati. He would from time to time publish them, and then later on they were collected and put. Although Sharanagati is a particular collection of songs, and Kalyan Kalpataru, that's also a particular long set of poems and songs in which he's analyzed all the philosophy and everything is there in these songs. There's Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayoja, and everything is there. So his writings alone established him as a great acharya. He was also personally preaching. He refounded the Namhata of Nityananda Prabhu. He discovered the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at Mayapur. So many things he did. There's enough time. I just written a few lines here about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Some pastimes that he had with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, which are not yet published anywhere in English. I hope to publish them fairly soon. In my book on Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, this is some extract from my upcoming book. He is known as the son of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, but he never considered himself as a son. He never considered Bhaktivinoda Thakur as a person of this mundane world. He considered him. Please wash your hand. Don't put your hand in your mouth. From the very beginning of his life, from his childhood, Vimala Prasad, Siddhanta Saraswati, his relationship with Bhaktivinoda Thakur was more like one of disciple to guru than son to father. Actually, this relationship is very similar, except that the son may tend to be more familiar with the father, or actually the son expects some service from the father. He may tend to take him for granted somewhat also. But the disciple is always very respectful to the guru, even if it's a friendly relationship. That's stated in Bhagavatam, the brahmachari with the guru. Guru sohrida suhridam, sudrida sohridam. So let's say that a brahmachari has a relationship with his guru of strong friendship. That doesn't mean he comes up and slaps him on the back. How are you doing there, Guruji? Not like that. But it means it's a very affectionate relationship, but very respectful also. So, Siddhanta Saraswati, as he was generally known, from the age of about 14, he was given this title for his learning. He was a genius in his childhood. So he was given this title. But he never related with Bhaktivinoda Thakur as father. He used to say that anyone who thinks of Bhaktivinoda Thakur as Baba, Baba means father in Bengali, then for him there will be a Badha. Anyone who thinks of him as Baba, there will be a Badha, which means an obstruction in the attainment of Radha. If you think of him as Baba, then there will be a Badha in attaining Radha. Actually, he said it in such a manner that unless you know Bengali, you can't. Anyway, if you say it in Bengali, it's more intricate how he said it. First of all, you learn Bengali, then you can understand. Because many of the things Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, you can't translate them actually into English. They're not really translated. Because there's such intricate Bengali and such, he used what he called Bhagavatiya Bhasha. That means the language was fully mixed up with Shastra. So unless you know Shastra, you can't understand what he said. Just like, for instance, he would refer to Vidya Viniveshata Janita Bhaya, which means that fear which is brought about by absorption in the secondary attitude. This is taken from Bhayam Tritiya Dvayam Dvitiya Niveshitasya, from a Bhagavatam shlok. So unless you know the Bhagavatam shlok and what it means, you can't understand at all what he's talking about. So very complex language he used. Anyway, just as a son should serve his father, or a disciple should serve his guru, so Saraswati Thakur used to serve Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Even though Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he had so many sons, he had 13 sons, and he had servants also, hired servants, because he was a babu, he was a respectable gentleman of. He attained the highest position that any British would allow an Indian to take in the government service, magistrate. So he was, anyway, his family had land, so he was coming from a rich family, Zamindar's family. So he had his own paid servants. Actually, paid in those days, they didn't pay them, they maintained them. That's a different system in those days. And he had his own, just like a disciple, Krishnadas Babaji was there to serve him in all respects. But anyway, Siddhanta Saraswati would serve his father by fanning him like this. Nowadays you just turn on the fan. But in those days, it was fanning, sometimes all night. The disciples, they would fan their guru all night. Because it's hot. You have to serve the guru. That was the idea. Bringing him water to drink and all these things. While he was actually the Bhaktivinoda Thakur, the last thing he wrote was called Swami Dwadashika. 12 verses in which he outlined what are his activities and what are his goals of life. So this was in 1910, and then he became severely paralyzed. And they took him to Calcutta. He was in Godrum, Surupganj. They took him to Calcutta, gave him all kinds of treatment, but it didn't work. Actually, his paralysis, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur analyzed, this was his Leela also. He wasn't suffering from paralysis, actually, but he was merged, for the last 4 years of his life, he was simply merged in smaranam, in thoughts of the Lord. And that he wasn't, he didn't speak with it, he couldn't speak, he couldn't move, but then sometimes he would speak, when he wanted to. Rarely, but so for 4 years he was incapacitated, but just very rarely he would say something when he wanted to. But mostly he was pretending to be paralyzed, so then he didn't have to talk to anyone, he didn't have to, he would be absorbed in thinking of the Lord. So this condition endured, and it seemed that he was about to leave this world. It appeared that he was very sick and he was about to leave this world. So certain envious persons, they started propagating that just see, this Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he made so many offenses to Vaishnavas by criticizing the caste Goswamis and the Sahajiyas and the fish eaters, because he criticized. He was somewhat polite about it, compared to Siddhanta Saraswati. For Siddhanta Saraswati, he didn't care about being polite. He was just absolutely open. This is bogus. Anything was bogus, he would immediately come out like fire against it. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he had criticized so many wrongdoings that was going on in the name of Lord Chaitanya. And so when he became sick like this, certain envious persons made propaganda that now he is getting the results, karmic results of his offenses. So seeing this, Siddhanta Saraswati came to his bedside and he said to him that you please stay with us for some more days and preach the gospel of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu more. In this way, even those ignorant rascals who are now criticizing you, they may also be benefited. So, from that day, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he gradually came back, and for some time he was again preaching Krishna consciousness. And those persons who criticized him, they repented and submitted themselves at his lotus feet. Now, one caste Goswami went to visit Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, who was staying in Navadip, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur was at that time staying in Calcutta. So, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj asked that caste Goswami. Caste Goswami means those who, anyways, they consider they were gurus by family connection. They considered that we should only be the gurus because we are descended from an associate of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So, on the basis of birth only, they were giving initiation. But in this way, the real qualification to be guru is that they should be absorbed in Krishna consciousness. They didn't think they needed that. I'm a descendant of whoever, Nityananda Prabhu or Gadadhar or whatever. And in this way they made themselves gurus. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur was against this. One caste Goswami went to visit Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj in Navadvip, and Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj said, when you go to Calcutta, please visit Bhaktivinoda Thakur and tell him not to remain in the place of Kali. Don't remain in Calcutta. That is Kali's Sthanam. That is the place where Kali Maharaj resides. So, this caste Goswami, he went to Bhaktivinoda Thakur and relayed this message. So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur asked him that when you see Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, you please convey my blessings to him and tell him that where I reside is not the place of Kali. Similarly, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj said that to Siddhanta Saraswati, that don't live in Calcutta. So, Siddhanta Saraswati told this once in a lecture in Calcutta. He told his disciples that my Guru Maharaj told me not to live in Calcutta. He said it in a lecture in Calcutta. So, he said that actually I never lived in Calcutta. I never lived there. Where I live is not Calcutta. I am surrounded by all of you. You're all devotees. So how can this be the place of Kali? This is the spiritual world. So that caste Goswami, Siddhanta Saraswati used to, when he was in Calcutta, he would just sit by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, just chant, go on chanting. Because during this time, this was the time of Shatakoti Nam Japa Yajna. He made a vow to chant 100 crores of the holy names. So this took him 9 years, and mostly he was in Mayapur, but sometimes he would come to Calcutta also, but he would be sitting by Bhaktivinoda Thakur chanting continuously. So that caste Goswami asked the Siddhanta, what does he mean? What does he say? I don't live in Calcutta. This is Calcutta. He was living in Bhakti Bhavan, was the name of his house. Bhaktivinoda Thakur made it. Manitala Street in Rambaga, Calcutta. So what is this? You're living in Calcutta. So then Siddhanta Saraswati explained to him from a song of Narottam Das that Jota Vaishnava Shesh Than Vrindavan. Where there is a Vaishnava, that place is Vrindavan. That place is not the material world. So, he then said, Siddhanta Saraswati said to the caste Goswami that most people who go to visit Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, they do so making a show of taking sadhu sangha, but they are not really willing to accept his instruction. So he therefore reciprocates with their materialistic outlook and speaks in a manner to cheat them as they desire to be cheated. You want to be cheated? You came to me wanting to be cheated? You want me to give you some materialistic benediction? Okay, take it. But it's only to those persons who approach him in full surrender does he open his heart and reveal the truth. Shortly thereafter, actually there are many things, it's not here in this extract. This Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he once told Siddhanta Saraswati that after I leave this world, most of my followers, they will deviate from me. So later on in a letter, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he wrote to certain persons who were deviated from him, they were followers of Bhaktivinoda Thakur who had deviated from Bhaktivinoda Thakur. How are we doing for time? We're supposed to finish? So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, they accused Siddhanta Saraswati of being deviated from Bhaktivinoda Thakur. But Siddhanta Saraswati wrote in a letter to one of these persons that Bhaktivinoda Thakur told me that most of my followers will deviate from me, and he said, I never told this to you before because I didn't want to hurt you. But actually he told me this in another lecture which was written as an essay. He said, Siddhanta Saraswati wrote that there are many persons who they consider themselves followers of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and some of them have even memorized all his teachings. They can quote all his books, but they don't understand any of it. So there are many persons who consider them his followers, but they don't understand actually what are his teachings. To understand his teachings, you have to associate with a pure devotee, which means himself. He wrote also in another essay in the Harmonist magazine, he wrote that simply to have many followers is not the sign of the success of a religious organization. He said, because a true prophet is actually understood by very few of those who claim to be his followers. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this way Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was saying that many people who call themselves his followers, they didn't actually understand him. If we have to understand Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we have to understand him through Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And in the parampara which is coming down like that. We are very, very fortunate by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. We are fortunate to have the opportunity to be introduced to the personality, teachings, writings and songs of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So, Prabhupada, he said that by reading my books one gets in touch with the Acharyas. But he encouraged us very much to read his books. But he also encouraged to study the writings of the previous Acharyas. And actually, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writings, they are very systematic and easy, relatively easy to understand, whereas Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's writings very difficult actually. So please, all of you read Prabhupada's books, Gita, Nectar of Devotion, Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita especially. Read all of them at least 3 or 4 times, and then you go on to other books. Then you read Bhaktivinoda Thakur's books. So many wonderful books. So you have to have time for all these things. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he made time. Somehow he was working, he had a whole family to maintain. He was a magistrate, he had a full-time job, and he also wrote so many books and did so many things. So no one should say, I don't have enough time, because I'm working. He was working, he did so many things. He was the ideal of an acharya in the Grihastha ashram. Although towards the end of his life, he renounced family life and just became absorbed in remembering Krishna. So there are so many things to say. I won't say anything more here because last week I got stopped around this time, so I guess it must be time to stop this time also. Just explain briefly the pranam, the general pranam mantra to him. Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satyayal Anandanamine. It's a very simple pranam mantra. We offer our respectful obeisances to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who was also given the name Satchidananda. Gaura Shakti Surupaya, he is the very form of the power of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and Rupa Yoga Varayate. Varayate means we're offering obeisances unto that form. Vara means the best of. So he is the best of the followers of the Swami. So we offer our respectful obeisances unto Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who is known as Satchidananda, who is the personification of the energy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and who is the best of the followers of the Guru.